In a single month this summer, two of the narrow seas on which the world's commerce depends were choked by force from two different directions by two different powers for two different reasons. At the mouth of the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, the passage through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil and gas has long moved, fell nearly silent. Iran had mined it and boarded ships in it and warned vessels away from it. In the course of a war that began with American and Israeli bombs in February, by the middle of July, on some days fewer than 20 ships made passage. They used to carry nearly 90. And most of those that did run ran with their transponders turned off, in the dark, hoping not to be seen. And 1,300 miles to the southwest, at the other end of the Arabian Peninsula, the Bab al-Mandab, the BAM, the strait that funnels traffic between the Red Sea and the wider ocean, the gateway itself to the Suez Canal, came under blockade from the opposite side. There, the Houthis of Yemen declared an embargo on shipping tied to Saudi Arabia and fired on two Saudi supertankers, one of which was left ablaze. Traffic did not stop, but it fell sharply, and the second of the world's great oil choke points was suddenly in doubt at the very moment the first had nearly failed. Two straits, one nearly closed, one newly blockaded, and between them the arteries of the world's trade pinched hard within the same few weeks. 400 years ago, a young Dutch lawyer wrote down the principle that these blockades strain against. And he did not write it as an opinion or a preference or a policy. He wrote it as a law of nature. The sea, he said, belongs to no one. No nation may own it. No nation may bar it. Because the sea is common to all mankind the way air is common. And the right to cross it freely and to trade across it is, in the phrase his translator would give him 3 centuries later, self-evident and immutable. The lawyer's name was Hugo Grotius, and he wrote in the Dutch Republic, whose birth we traced on Saturday. At this episode, the question is not only whether the sea still belongs to no one. It is a second question, closer to home and a bit harder. When the sea is contested, and America turns to its military to exert force over it, who decides that we fight? The Constitution begins with a very plain answer. Our own recent history has complicated it at every turn. This is Episode 7, Part B. The Sea Belongs to No One. And I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is the contemporary application for Episode 7 of our series, Self-Evident, The Road to 1776. On Saturday, in the episode titled The Dutch Experiment, we watched a nation of merchants improvise a republic in the empty place where a king had stood. A tolerant, commercial commonwealth that grew rich enough to become the wonder of its age. And near the end of that story stood a jurist named Hugo Grotius, who gave the Dutch commercial republic its intellectual charter on the seas, the argument that the ocean is free to all nations and can be owned by no one. This episode, we take the argument off the page and we hold it against a summer in which the free sea is under siege from two directions at once, and we follow it to a question that it forces upon us about who in our republic holds the power to take a nation to war. A slight word of political transparency before I go on, because I am going to handle live and contested things. This is an episode that is a point in time in July of 2026, and I am going to talk about the war with Iran, about blockades and strikes and the closing of straits, and about the conduct of a sitting administration. This episode itself is not aimed at picking a side on whether that war was wise or foolish or just or unjust or well or badly fought. We can do that elsewhere. We will do that elsewhere. But I am talking to all sides of this particular conflict. So the episode itself, I want viewed by everybody, whether they have a vested interest or are indifferent to who is at fault. The target of this episode is not the actual war itself. Again, we've done that elsewhere. There's many other videos on my channel. You can find me on X. You can find me on Facebook. We can talk about it there. The target of this episode is the question of who is constitutionally permitted to begin a war. And that question does not care which party holds the White House, because the answer protects a citizen of every political persuasion. It says that the decision to spend American lives in war belongs to the many and never to the one. When you hear me describe what a president has done, hear it as a structural question about the office, not a verdict on the man or his term. The office is the subject. So with that said, let us get into it. Let us begin.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast. Here we ask a simple question of the history and the actions that have shaped our lives.
Did this leave us more free or more governed? Because what we do not know can be used to govern us.
And what we choose to ignore always will.
In February of 1603, the Strait of Singapore, a small fleet belonging to the Dutch East India Company, attacked and captured a Portuguese merchant ship, the Santa Catarina, laden with one of the richest cargoes then afloat. The seizure was enormously profitable and legally awkward. The Dutch were at war with Spain, and Portugal was joined to the Spanish crown, so there was a case that the capture was a lawful prize. But the sum was so large, and the act so much like ordinary piracy, that the company wanted a proper legal defense of it. They commissioned a young lawyer, barely past 20, already regarded as a prodigy. His name was Hugo Grotius. And what Grotius produced went far beyond the case. He wrote a sprawling treatise on the law of prize and booty, most of it which stayed unpublished within his lifetime. One chapter of it, though, was revised as a standalone and appeared in 1609 as the little book that made him famous. To justify the Dutch presence in the eastern waters at all, he had to answer the Portuguese claim that lay behind everything. The claim that Portugal, by prior discovery and papal grant, owned the sea routes to the Indies and could lawfully bar every other nation from them. Against the idea of a closed sea, Mare Clausium, Grotius set the idea that would carry his name, the free sea, Mare Liberum. His argument did not rest on Dutch interest, though Dutch interest is what prompted it. It rested on nature. And for Grotius, nature was not a secular thing. Some things, he said, cannot by their nature be owned. The air cannot be fenced and parceled. The ocean is the same. It is too vast, too fluid, too plainly meant for the common use of all to become the private property of any prince or any nation. God himself, Grotius wrote, speaks this through nature. Providence had scattered the world's good unevenly among peoples precisely so that the mutual need would draw them into trade and fellowship across the sea. And from that he drew what he called the most basic axiom of the law of nations, a first principle whose rationale in Latin he called manifest and immutable, that every nation is free to travel to every other and to trade with it across the sea that belongs to none of them. Now the phrase you will have been waiting for and the honest truth about it, when Grotius's treaty was rendered into English 3 centuries later in the 1916 translation that carried it to the modern world, the first axiom that came into English as self-evident and immutable. The ringing English phrase is the translator's, not Grotius's own Latin. So it would be too much to draw a straight verbal line from this page all the way to Philadelphia. But the deeper kinship is real and is the thing worth holding. Grotius stood inside the natural law tradition that treated certain principles as prior to any government and binding upon every ruler. A century and a half after Grotius, other men would open their founding document by holding certain truths to be self-evident. The words came through a translator. The mode of argument came down the same long river. Grotius put it to sea. Jefferson would put it to the whole condition of a free people. And the road from one to the other is the road this series travels. That is the principle. Now the two places where it is being strained. Let us begin with the Hormuz, because it is the one most talked about, it's the one you're most familiar with. We've heard its name over the past several months. It is a narrow dogleg of water between Iran and Oman, and through it passed, in ordinary times, something on the order of 20% of the world's oil and comparable share of its LNG, or liquefied natural gas. It is arguably the single most strategically concentrated stretch of sea on Earth. On the 28th of February this year, the United States and Israel launched a war on Iran and a campaign of airstrikes that, by the accounts now on record, killed Iran's supreme leader and a great many of its officials. Iran struck back at Israel and American bases and the Gulf states and reached for the weapon its geography places squarely within its reach. It choked the strait. It laid naval mines. Its Revolutionary Guard boarded and fired on merchant ships and warned the rest away. The United States answered with air campaign to reopen the passage, and then in April with a naval blockade of Iran's own ports. A brief agreement in June reopened traffic for a matter of weeks, but by mid-July the shooting had resumed and the strait had closed again in all but name. A handful of transits a day where there were once nearly 90, running dark to avoid being targeted. Set beside that the American position on the law, because in its formal shape, it is Grotius, nearly word for word. The United States has insisted that Hormuz is an international strait and that no power on its shore may extinguish that passage or convert it to a private gate. That is Mare Liberum 4 centuries on, but hold the American position up to the light because it has not been steady. In mid-July, the president proposed that the United States collect a 20% fee on cargo moving through the strait, a toll on the very passage he had called common, and then dropped the proposal the next day under pressure from Gulf allies. The United States was at the same time running its own blockade of Iran's ports. Now, I will return to what that does to the American claim, but for now, on the stated principle, Washington and the Dutch jurist agree. In the conduct, it is more tangled than the principle admits. Now, on the other end of the Arabian Peninsula, and the same principle strained from the opposite direction, the Bab al-Mandab is the strait between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, the southern approach to the Suez Canal. In the years before the current disruption, something on the order of 1/10 of the world's seaborne oil moved through it, some of which is the same oil coming from the Strait of Hormuz. This month, the Houthis of Yemen, the Iran-aligned movement that had already spent the Gaza war firing on Red Sea shipping, declared an embargo on shipping tied to Saudi Arabia and fired on 2 Saudi supertankers, leaving 1 on fire. Traffic did not stop, but it did fall sharply. And the Red Sea route that had been the relief valve while the Hormuz was choked was suddenly left in question. Portugal, 4 centuries ago, claimed a permanent peacetime monopoly on the sea itself, grounded in discovery and papal grant. Iran and the Houthis claimed something narrower and different, a wartime and retaliatory authority to interdict particular shipping tied to a live conflict. These are not the same legal claim. And Grotius, who wrote a whole treatise justifying the seizure of ships in war, would have been the first to say so. But from the deck of a neutral merchant vessel, the recurring danger is recognizable across all of them. Passage through a common artery of the world's trade has been made to depend on the permission of power able to fire on those who cross without it. The costume's different. The underlying thing is what Grotius has set his principle against, and the sea belongs to no one. The principle is one thing. The American response to the violation is another. And it is here that the episode meets the one before it. In episode 6, part B, last week, the argument was that Congress has handed away the power to the Constitution, the power to make law. It did so, we saw, not by being conquered, but by abdicating, writing statutes vague enough to let the executive fill in the substance because holding the power itself was politically costly. This episode, the same failure appears in an even graver form, because there is one power the Constitution guards even more jealously than the power to make law. It is the power to make war. The text begins plainly, even if presidents and Congresses have contested its boundaries ever since. Article 1, Section 8. The Congress shall have the power to declare war. Not the president. The framers had watched the European kings take their nations into war on a whim, spending the lives of subjects who had no say in it, and they built the American Republic specifically to prevent that. After the Constitutional Convention, they changed the language from a power to make war to a power to declare it, leaving the president the authority to repel a sudden attack, but reserving to Congress the decision to begin a war. They gave the president command of the armies once war is authorized, but the decision to enter the war in the first place, they placed deliberately in the many, in the branch you elect. It was like the placement of the lawmaking power, a decision to keep the gravest decisions where the people could reach them and have direct accountability. Now measure our own moment against the text. In the war with Iran, a war involving sustained airstrikes on another nation, a naval blockade against the nation's ports, and hundreds of American service members in harm's way, Congress has not declared war. It has not enacted any authorization for the conflict at all. On the 10th of July, the president signed a letter informing Congress that military action had been recommended days earlier. The letter did not, in its own words, announce a new 60-day clock, but the administration's stated position that the earlier ceasefire had ended the first round of hostilities led reporters and lawmakers to read the renewed campaign as a claimed reset of that clock, a fresh window in which war could be waged without going back to Congress. Members of both parties immediately disputed that reading. Consider what that theory amounts to. The president may take a country into sustained combat on his own authority, notify Congress after the fact, and then treat a 60-day clock as a window during which the war was simply his to conduct. And, on the administration's reading, restart the clock when a lull ends. In that theory, Congress's role is not to decide whether a war goes on. It is to be informed that it does. This is the abdication of Episode 6, Part B in its gravest form. There, the power drained away was the power to write rules you live under. Here, it is the power to decide whether your sons and daughters are sent to kill and die. And the mechanism rhymes. A vague statute let the executive fill in the law. A permissive reading of the war powers clock lets the executive fill in the war. But Congress has not been wholly silent. And that fact complicates the picture even more. It makes the real charge even sharper, not softer. Members of both parties have forced vote after vote. The House has twice passed measures calling on the president to end the war. On one recent day, it did so again while the Senate fell 2 votes short of a binding resolution to halt it. Earlier in the conflict, the Senate actually passed a war powers resolution when a handful of Republicans crossed the aisle before the effort stalled. So it is not true that no one has voted. A majority of the members who cast votes have said, in one chamber or another, bring this war to an end. What is true is narrower and worse. None of it has become binding law. The House measures do not bind. The binding measures fall short or die in the other chamber, or would meet a veto that no one can override. And so the war goes on, unauthorized and unterminated, while the branch that alone may declare it votes and cannot make its voice into law. This is the abdication in its subtlest and most honest form. It is not that Congress did nothing. It is that Congress has proven structurally unable or unwilling in sufficient numbers to convert its own constitutional authority into a binding act. A war is being fought. No congressional majority has voted to authorize it, and no congressional majority has managed to stop it. The body built to make the decision has been reduced to registering an opinion about a decision made without it. Every week on Self-Evident, we go looking for the same thing, the moment an idea about human freedom first entered the world, and the reason why it still matters to you right now. Here's how the week works, and starting now, there is something new. It begins before the week even starts. The Sunday before, we publish a written piece on our website, the deep version, fully sourced, for the reader who wants the whole argument on the page. That is where the week is anchored. Then on Saturday, we tell the story, the thinker, the document, the turning point, the history itself. From the ancient world to the founding, that is our historical episode. On Tuesday, we bring it home. We take that piece of history and we hold it against a debate happening in America today. Because none of this is dead, every one of these ideas is still being fought over. That is our contemporary Part B episode. And now, on Thursdays, we'll be adding a third voice to the week. We're opening the conversation up. For several of the weeks remaining in this series, the week will close with an interview, a real conversation with someone who lives inside that week's theme. Some weeks that will be a politician making the case from inside the arena. Some weeks a historian who has spent a career in the sources we are only visiting. An economist to sharpen the argument about markets and money and power. A business person who feels the weight of policy in a way the rest of us only read about. And a host of liberty-minded individuals just like you, just like me, who have thought hard about what it means to be free. Here's why this matters. History can feel like it happened to other people a long time ago. It did not. The fight over who holds power, whether you are free or governed, is the same fight. It just wears different clothes in every century. When you hear someone living a fight today talk about the thinker who started it 400 years ago, the whole thing comes alive. The article gives you the depth, the history gives you the roots, the application shows you the stakes, and the interview puts a living face on it all. So join us, read it, then watch it. Saturday, Tuesday, and now Thursday. Every week, one question runs underneath it all. Did this leave us more free or more governed? Let us go find out together. Now, the free sea does not come to us with clean hands, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. Grotius did not write Mare Liberum as a disinterested philosopher gazing out into the ocean. He wrote it as a commissioned advocate for the Dutch East India Company, one of the most ruthless commercial enterprises in history, and he wrote it specifically to justify that company's seizure of a rival nation's ship. The Great Charter of the Freedom of the Seas began its life as a legal brief for an act that looked an awful lot like armed robbery. And the freedom it proclaimed was, in no small part, the freedom the Dutch wanted for themselves, the freedom to sail into the waters the Portuguese claimed and to take the trade and the plunder for Amsterdam. The same company whose advocate wrote that the sea was common to all mankind would go on to build an empire of monopoly and slavery on the far side of that sea. But none of this makes the principle false. That's the thing that we hold on to in this series. A jurist advancing his client's commercial cause can reach for and articulate a truth larger than the case, a truth that outlives the sordid occasion of its writing. The freedom of the seas did not stay a Dutch trading advantage. It became, over centuries, one of the foundations of international law, invoked by the weak against the strong, codified and generalized far beyond anything the company intended. The kinship between Grotius and the Declaration is real, even though Grotius wrote as a company's advocate. The series has never asked you to admire the men without qualification. It has asked you to follow the ideas and be honest about the flawed hands that carried them. And that same honesty has to be turned on our own country, or the whole argument of this hour is worth nothing. In mid-July, the president proposed a 20% American fee on cargo passing through the strait. That is a toll on the common sea, the very thing Mare Liberum forbids. He abandoned it only under pressure from Gulf allies. And at the same time, the United States was running its own naval blockade of Iran's ports. Now, an American blockade of wartime adversaries' ports is not the legal equivalent of Iran mining a strait against all comers. There is a real distinction between a belligerent action against one nation and the closing of a common passage against the world. But that distinction does not let Washington off the hook of its own principle. A nation that proclaims the free sea and then floats a toll on it, that invokes Grotius and then blockades, cannot be cast as a simple guardian of the ocean. The principle indicts more than Iran. It indicts everyone who reaches, when it suits them, for the power to decide who may cross. Grotius was a flawed hand, so is the country that quotes him. The free sea is true anyway, and it judges us too. Now, like we often do, the objections stated at full strength. And there are two serious objections here, and they are stated by people who likely know more about it than I do, and maybe more about it than you do. So let's hear them out. Let's hear what these objections are. And the first objection turns Grotius against me. The freedom of the seas, the critic says, has never been sustained by principle alone. It has been sustained by a great naval power willing to enforce it with guns. It was British sea power that underwrote the free sea in the 19th century, though on British terms, and alongside of plenty British blockades. An American sea power that has kept the lanes open since the Second World War within a web of alliances and a developed law of the sea. Grotius wrote the words, "But fleets made them hold." So when an American president acts with force to reopen a strait that Iran has mined shut, he is not betraying a Grotian order. He is doing the thing that has actually preserved it. And on this reading, the demand that he wait for a formal congressional declaration while mines are in the water and tankers are burning and a fifth of the world's oil sits blocked is not constitutional principle. It is a dangerous fantasy. War does not keep congressional hours. The framers themselves, the critic notes, changed the Constitution's language from make war to declare war, precisely to leave the president the power to repel sudden attacks without waiting for a vote. And the second objection is narrower and sharper. It goes straight at my central claim. The president, the critic says, is not evading law here. He is following it. The War Powers Resolution of 1973, passed by Congress itself, expressly contemplates that a president may introduce forces into hostilities and then has a window of 60 days before he must either obtain authorization or withdraw. That is not a loophole. That is the statute working as written. Congress built the 60-day clock. If the president runs it, he is obeying a law Congress passed. And if Congress dislikes how the war is going, it has the power to end it tomorrow by statute, by the purse, by refusing to fund it. That it has not done so is not the president's abdication. It is Congress's choice. You cannot call it stolen when the owner keeps handing it over. Now, both of those are strong objections, but here's where each one breaks. The first objection is right that sea power enforces the free sea and wrong about what follows. There's a difference, a constitutional difference, not a semantic one, between using force to keep a strait open and waging a sustained war on the nation that closed it. Escorting tankers, clearing mines, answering fire from a boat that fires on you. These are the uses of force that a president's power to repel attack can plausibly reach. And the framers' change from make to declare was meant to reach them. Bombing another country's city for months, blockading its ports, killing its supreme leader, these are not the repelling of a sudden attack. They are a war. And a war is the thing the Constitution says presidents may not begin alone. The objection proves that the president may act to defend passage. It does not prove that he may take the nation into a months-long war and call it the same thing. Now, that was kind of easy to defend. The second objection is a little bit harder because it is partially right. And the part where it is right is the most damning part of the whole story. But it also misreads the statute. And the misreading is worth correcting because the statute answers the objection in its own text. The War Powers Resolution does not say the president may make war for 60 days. It says the opposite. Its opening section lists the only 3 grounds on which a president may introduce forces into hostilities at all: a declaration of war, a specific statutory authorization, or a national emergency created by an attack on the United States. Then its final section states in plain words that nothing in the resolution grants the president any authority he does not already possess. The 60-day clock is not a grant of 60 days of war. It is a backstop, a deadline by which hostilities that were never properly authorized must end. Presidents have inverted it, reading a ceiling as a license, treating a deadline to stop as permission to continue. And Congress has let that inversion harden into settled practice. That reading is the abdication. The statute meant to leash presidential war-making has been picked up by presidents as a permission slip, and Congress has watched it happen. So take the objection at its strongest, and it still fails. Yes, the 60-day clock is a statute Congress passed, but it is a statute that denies it grants war-making power, not one that confers it. Yes, Congress could move to end the war, but only by passing a binding measure over a near certain veto, which needs 2/3 supermajority it has not been able to assemble, or by wielding the power of the purse, which it has flinched from using. That difficulty is real. It does not clear Congress, it convicts it. The critic says the power is not stolen because the owner keeps handing it over. That is precisely the indictment. In episode 6, part B, the owner handed over the power to make law by writing vague statutes. Here, the owner hands over the power to make war by reading a leash as a license and declining to pull it tight. A right you will not enforce decade after decade while the executive exercises it for you is not a right you still meaningfully hold. It is a right you have surrendered in every way but the paperwork. The clock is not a vote, and Congress that hides behind the clock has not escaped the charge. It has confessed to it. Let us bring it home the way we do every week with the Liberty Test. The plain question we ask whether a group of people acting together may rightfully do what no individual among them could rightfully do alone, and whether an arrangement leaves people more free or more governed. Start with the war power itself. No individual among us has the right to take his neighbors into a war, to commit their lives, their sons, their treasure to a killing on the far side of the world on his own say-so. That is not a power any one of us holds. So the question the Liberty Test asks, can that power be created by gathering it into a single office? Can a nation of hundreds of millions rightfully arrange things so that one man alone may decide to spend their lives in war? The framers answered no. They took the one power that most tempts a ruler to tyranny, the sword, and they refused to place it in a single hand. They lodged the decision to draw it in the many, in the branch closest to the people, precisely because the decision to make war is the least safe to trust one with. This is the fancy hats and larger mobs in its gravest application. The office of the presidency does not manufacture a right to make war that no person possesses. And a 60-day clock does not manufacture it either. No procedure, no statute, no envelope delivered to Congress conjures into being a power to war alone that the people never delegated to one man, because it was never theirs to delegate to him in the first place. Now the Dutch half of the test. The lesson on Saturday's episode pressed hardest. The Dutch Republic protected liberty, we saw, largely because its power was scattered across provinces, across towns, across offices, so that no single hand could ever close around every throat at once. And the darker half of that lesson, such a scattered arrangement is not stable. It has to be actively held because the pull runs always toward the center, toward the single hand. The Dutch themselves drifted over time toward the crown they never quite put on. We are living an American version of that drift. For a century, the power to make war has flowed steadily and with our permission from the many toward the one. From the Congress the framers trusted with it toward the presidency they feared to trust with it. Each step taken in an emergency, each justified by an urgency, each ratified by a Congress that found it easier to be told than to decide. And the freedom of the seas that Grotius called self-evident is now defended, when it is defended, by a war power that has quietly ceased to be self-governed. We are keeping the outer form, the free sea, the constitutional text, the elections, while letting the inner substance drain toward the single hand. The Dutch warning is the American president. The arrangement that protects a free people will not hold itself. It has to be held. And a people that lets war power gather into one hand has not made itself safer. It has only made itself more governed and led itself to hope every day that that hand stays gentle to them. That is the inheritance of the Dutch experiment and of the Dutch jurist made present. The sea belongs to no one, and the sword belongs to the many. A free people forgets either at its own peril, and we are in some danger this summer of forgetting both at once. This Thursday, we close the week with a conversation. I will be joined by Jamie Frost Remmey, the Libertarian nominee for the United States House in Pennsylvania's 1st Congressional District. She is running as an outsider against both major parties in a race that puts the questions of this hour to a practical test. We will take the ideas of this week off the page and into a live campaign, what a single member of Congress can actually do to reclaim the powers the branch has surrendered. Why a movement of outsiders keeps running into a system built to keep them out, and what it means to defend the guard, to keep a state's own soldiers from being sent to a war no one declared. That is Thursday, and I hope you will join us for that. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been Episode 7, Part B, of Self-Evident, The Road to 1776 on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com. There you'll find all written articles, as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause, the New Leviathan, and Empire of Liberty. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes, and follow me on X at jkellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Speaking of participation, I had some comments this past week that were directing some of my shorts or reels or cut-ups against a specific party or against a specific a team alignment. And I want to be clear, and there is a difference between parties and ideologies. Political parties, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the Libertarian Party, they are meant to coalesce votes together to win elections. Ideologies run underneath of those, and sometimes are not even aligned with the party that purports to represent a said ideology. Republicanism isn't necessarily the same thing as conservatism or libertarianism. Democratic Party goals are not necessarily aligned with majority democracy or allocracy, as Polybius would have stated it. They are again meant to collect and gather votes. And those parties, all political parties in our country and others, have changed over time. They have adapted to popular movements. We're seeing that again today as we watch the Democratic Party slide and move more towards democratic socialism or socialistic ideologies and systems. We're seeing the same thing that we saw in the past with Republican Party move towards a different form of populism. That's not an indictment on those parties. It is clarity on what those parties are trying to do. So a word of caution if you are aligning yourself with a party, or as sometimes we say, a team, because you feel that team embodies your own ideology. I would ask you to take a look at that ideology specifically. We have created some tools on our website at consequentialactions.com. There's a series, just in the written form, not podcast versions of it, but just in the written form, called Parties, Systems, and Ideologies, or Parties, Ideologies, and Systems, one or the other. And it walks through step by step the definitions of parties, the definitions of ideologies, and the definitions of economic systems to help classify terms that often get conflated together. And it allows us to speak more clearly and more plainly about the ideas we are trying to discuss. So I encourage you to participate, and I want to thank the viewers' participation for that comment on one of my threads. With that said, until next time, have a great day.